Have you ever experienced the unsettling feeling of being pulled away from everything familiar, everything you love? It can feel like being left in the dark, surrounded by silence, as though all that once held meaning is now just out of reach. In these moments, you might wonder if you've been forgotten, abandoned, or perhaps even punished. But what if, in truth, this isolation is not a sign of rejection, but a divine act of preparation? The Bible offers us a glimpse into this mysterious process in Mark 11:12-13, where we see Jesus led by the Spirit into the desert, embarking on a time of solitude before he began his ministry. This wasn't a punishment, but a divine preparation, a sacred moment meant to strengthen him for the calling ahead. Could it be that, like Jesus, there is purpose in our isolation, that God is using these moments to transform us, to deepen our faith, and to ready us for the blessings he has in store? Throughout the journey of biblical history, we see a recurring theme. God uses times of separation to prepare his children for greater purposes. These periods of isolation, though often difficult, are not accidents or misfortunes. They are deeply woven into God's character and plans. It is in the quiet, away from the distractions and noise of the world, that God refines us, shapes our hearts, and reveals his will. From the stories of his chosen ones, we see that before a person can be elevated, blessed, or used for a great purpose, they must first endure a process of stripping away, the removal of worldly comfort, the breaking down of pride, and the testing of faith. This isn't a random pattern. It's a deliberate and loving act by a father who knows what his children need to grow. Take Moses, for example. Before he could lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he spent 40 years in the desert, far from the riches and power of the Egyptian court. The life Moses once knew, one of privilege and luxury, was replaced by the harshness and isolation of the wilderness. Yet this wasn't a punishment, but a preparation for something far greater. God used these years to humble Moses, to transform him from a prince into a servant, and to teach him the crucial lesson that leadership is not about power, but about humility, dependence, and trust in God. Moses was stripped of everything, and in that place of emptiness, he encountered God in a way he never would have in the courts of Egypt. It was there at the burning bush in Exodus 3 that God called Moses to his divine mission. Had Moses not spent those years in the desert, alone and broken, he would not have been prepared to lead God's people. His solitude wasn't a void, but a sacred preparation for his destiny. The same principle applies to the life of David. Before he became king of Israel, David spent many years hiding in caves, pursued relentlessly by King Saul. His life was one of constant danger and isolation, yet in those years of loneliness, David's relationship with God deepened. He poured out his soul in the Psalms, giving us some of the most beautiful and profound prayers ever written. In Psalm 23, David writes, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." This intimate trust in God, cultivated in the wilderness, was what equipped David to rule with wisdom and courage. His years of isolation were not wasted. They shaped him into the leader God had called him to be. Without those times of solitude, David might never have developed the depth of humility and trust in God that defined his reign. The desert, whether literal or figurative, is a spiritual place, one where God removes distractions and brings us face to face with our weaknesses. Even Jesus, at the start of his ministry, was led into the desert by the Spirit, where he fasted for 40 days and faced temptations. It was in this desolate place that he experienced profound communion with the Father. Far from being a time of inactivity, this period of isolation was one of preparation, strengthening Jesus for the mission ahead. Just as he needed those 40 days, we too will face times when God leads us into the desert, not to punish, but to prepare us for what is to come. In our own lives, we often experience these moments of separation in ways that are deeply painful and confusing. Perhaps you have lost a relationship that once felt secure, or an opportunity that seemed perfect has slipped through your fingers. Maybe you feel a deep, unshakable emptiness that refuses to go away. In these times, it can be easy to think that God has abandoned you. But remember the words of Jeremiah 29:11, where God assures us, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Even when we don't understand what's happening, we can trust that God is at work, shaping us, preparing us, and leading us towards something better. Consider the life of Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and spent years in Egypt, first as a servant and later in prison for a crime he did not commit. From a human perspective, Joseph's life seemed doomed. Yet amid his suffering and isolation, God was preparing him for an incredible purpose. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph declares to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What seemed like a series of painful setbacks was part of God's perfect plan. Joseph's time of isolation wasn't wasted. It was the necessary foundation for his eventual rise to power in Egypt, where he would save countless lives during a time of famine. Isolation, as painful as it is, has a redemptive purpose. When everything is stripped away, when we are left with nothing but God, it is in that space that we can truly encounter His presence. Psalm 46:10 calls us to be still and know that I am God. In our busy, fast-pacing world, stillness feels like a luxury we can't afford. Yet it is in those quiet moments, when the noise of the world fades away, that we can hear God's voice most clearly. In those moments, we are reminded that while our strength is limited, God's power is limitless. The stillness may be uncomfortable, but it is there that we find peace, strength, and a deeper connection with the Creator. Job, in his suffering, cried out, "Oh, that I knew where I might find Him, that I might come to His seat." Job 23:03, his anguish was real, and yet, even in his desperation, Job recognized that God was working behind the scenes. He proclaimed, "He knows the way that I take. When He has tested me, I shall come forth as gold." Job 23:10, this powerful realization that isolation has a refining purpose, gives us the strength to endure in faith, even when the road is rough and the end is not in sight. In our world, isolation is often viewed as a failure, a sign of rejection, but from God's perspective, it is a sign of divine love. He is not abandoning us. He is setting us apart for something greater. This truth is evident in the life of Elijah. After his great victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah found himself in a deep depression, fleeing into the desert, wishing for death. But it was there in his lowest moment that God found him. 1 Kings 19:11 tells us that God did not reveal Himself in a mighty wind, an earthquake, or a fire, but in a gentle whisper. It was in that whisper that Elijah found the strength to continue his mission. Today, perhaps you are in a place where it feels like nothing is happening, where doors are closing and your efforts seem in vain, but take heart. God may be calling you into a season of separation so that you can hear His voice more clearly. These moments are temporary, and they are part of God's perfect plan. He has not abandoned you. He is preparing you for what lies ahead. Isaiah 40:31 reassures us, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." God uses these times of isolation to teach us to trust in His provision and perfect timing. The Israelites spent 40 years in the desert, not because they had sinned, but because God was preparing them to receive the promised land. In Deuteronomy 8:2-3, Moses reminds them, "Remember how the Lord your God led you in the wilderness these 40 years to humble you and test you to know what was in your heart. The desert was a time of testing, a time to learn to trust in God's faithfulness and to rely on Him for both physical and spiritual sustenance. In our own lives, these times of waiting may feel unbearable, but they are an essential part of God's preparation for what is to come. Consider Hannah, the mother of Samuel, who spent years in isolation, her heart heavy with grief as she longed for a child. In 1 Samuel 1:10 and 11, we read of her anguish as she poured out her soul before the Lord in prayer. She vowed, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life." God answered her prayer and gave her a son, Samuel, but He also used that time of isolation to shape her faith and character, preparing her for the great task ahead. Like Hannah, we too may experience times of emotional isolation, but in those moments, God is shaping us, preparing us for the blessings He will soon bestow. And then there's the story of Paul, who after his encounter with Christ spent years in isolation, away from the public eye, preparing for his ministry. In Galatians 1:15-17, Paul writes, "God was pleased to reveal His Son in me so that I might preach Him among the Gentiles. I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus." These years of solitude were not wasted. They were a time of deepening revelation, a time when God prepared Paul for the mission that would change the course of history. Isolation, in the end, is not a punishment. It is a process of preparation, a time when God calls us to be still, to listen, and to trust. It is in those moments that we are refined, that our character is strengthened, and that we are prepared for the plans God has for us. It's in the quiet, in the solitude, that we learn to hear His voice clearly, to trust His timing, and to walk boldly into the future He has prepared. And just like Ruth, who found redemption amid loss, we too will find unexpected blessings on the other side of our isolation. This time of isolation, though it may have felt like a heavy burden, was not just a pause in Ruth's life. It was the sacred groundwork for a profound new beginning. It not only prepared her heart to receive the unimaginable blessing of a new marriage and the gift of a son, but also positioned her uniquely in the genealogical line of Jesus. Think about that. A woman who had endured so much loss and heartache found herself at the center of God's redemptive plan for humanity. Her story serves as a reminder to each of us that God doesn't waste our seasons of solitude. He uses them to connect us to purposes far greater than we can ever conceive in our earthly minds. Those times when we feel alone, disconnected, or even forgotten are often the very moments God is working behind the scenes to redirect us, shape us, and prepare us for something extraordinary. It's crucial to recognize, too, that isolation doesn't always equate to being entirely alone. In fact, in the stillness and quiet, God often redefines our relationships. He leads us to people who will walk alongside us, who will help us grow, and who will influence our spiritual journeys in ways we can't yet see. Take, for instance, the story of Daniel and his friends in Babylon. These young men were far from their homeland, exiled in a hostile land that sought to erase their identity. Yet despite the challenges they faced, they were never truly alone because they had each other. Their unwavering support for one another amid their trials is something we can all learn from. When they chose to refuse the king's food and wine, an act that would cost them much in terms of their standing and comfort, they did so as an act of obedience to God. This decision, detailed in Daniel 1:8 and 9, wasn't just a test of their physical stamina, but of their spiritual resilience. Their time of isolation was, in truth, a time of strengthening and unity in faith, and it prepared them to fulfill a purpose far beyond their understanding. Much like Daniel, in our seasons of isolation, God can work wonders. What feels like a barren land, a time where nothing seems to happen, may be the fertile ground where new opportunities, relationships, and dreams are being born. This can be a moment when God opens doors that we didn't even know existed, paths that would never have been revealed to us had we stayed comfortable or busy with distractions. Jeremiah 33:3 speaks to this truth, offering a divine invitation. Call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. Even in the darkest moments of our lives, when we feel as though our prayers go unanswered, God is actively working, ready to reveal His plans if we seek His guidance with sincerity. Our part is to keep our eyes focused on His promises, trusting that He is always faithful and that His plans for us are always good. Lamentations 3:22-23 reassures us, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. It's in these quiet moments, these times when we seem most isolated, that God works within us in the deepest ways. Much like Joseph, who later declared, God meant it for good, Genesis 50:20, we too can find comfort in the fact that God is always working in our lives, even when it doesn't seem so. These seasons, though filled with waiting and wondering, are never wasted. Often the very moments when we feel most alone are the ones that shape us the most, helping us grow in our faith and character. Take Abraham's story, for example. When God promised him that he would be the father of a great nation, Abraham had to wait for many years before he saw the fulfillment of that promise. During that time, he and Sarah faced countless moments of doubt and loneliness. Yet, through their waiting, they learned to trust in God's timing, even when they couldn't understand how it would all come together. In Genesis 15:05, God told Abraham, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be." The promise was clear, but the fulfillment took time. Those years of waiting were not years of absence. They were years of preparation, helping Abraham grow in trust and dependence on God. Eventually, in Genesis 21, Abraham held in his arms the child of promise, Isaac, a testament to God's faithfulness and perfect timing. Similarly, we see the story of John the Baptist, whose time in the wilderness was not one of abandonment, but of preparation. In Luke 1:80, it's written, "And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel." The wilderness, far from being a place of neglect, was a place where God strengthened John, equipping him for the significant mission ahead. Just as John was prepared in the wilderness for his public ministry, so too are we sometimes called into times of isolation to prepare us for the mission that God has ordained for our lives. While these spiritual deserts may seem barren and hopeless at times, they are in fact the very places where God strengthens us, molds us, and makes us ready for what is to come. Consider the example of Jesus, who, after his baptism, was led into the wilderness for 40 days where he was tempted by the devil. Matthew 4:01 says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." This time in the wilderness wasn't a mere coincidence. It was a divinely appointed part of his preparation for his ministry. It was during this time of isolation that Jesus demonstrated his full reliance on God's Word, quoting Scripture in response to each temptation. In the wilderness, Jesus wasn't just enduring, he was learning, growing, and demonstrating how to stand firm in his faith and identity. Isolation also has a powerful way of revealing the areas of our lives that need healing and transformation. For Jacob, a man who had spent much of his life relying on his cunning and strength, his time of isolation before meeting Esau was a turning point. In Genesis 32:24-28, Jacob wrestles with a man through the night, and as the dawn breaks, his name is changed to Israel, a name that symbolizes a transformation from a manipulator to a man who would fully trust in God. This struggle wasn't just physical, it was deeply spiritual. Jacob had to confront his insecurities and the need to surrender fully to God's plan. The time spent in isolation, though painful, became the very process that reshaped him and prepared him for what lay ahead. Hebrews 12:11 tells us, "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it." In isolation, we often face the challenge of letting go of old identities, of past failures, of the things that no longer serve us. Peter's story offers another powerful example of how isolation can lead to profound restoration. After denying Jesus 3 times, Peter was left alone with his guilt and shame. But rather than being abandoned, Jesus restored him with a deep personal conversation. In John 21:15 and 17, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" This wasn't a question of condemnation, but of restoration. Jesus gave Peter a new opportunity to follow him, a chance to redefine his identity and mission. Similarly, when we face our moments of failure or doubt, God doesn't leave us to wallow in our isolation. Instead, he meets us there, offering grace, forgiveness, and a renewed sense of purpose. Finally, isolation calls us to a deeper intimacy with God, a place where we can hear his voice more clearly. In Psalms 46:10, we're invited to be still and know that I am God. In the chaos of daily life, this is not easy, but it is in the stillness, in the quiet moments, that we truly hear God's heart for us. Think of Mary, the sister of Martha, who chose to sit at Jesus' feet while her sister was distracted by the many tasks at hand. In Luke 10:41-42, Jesus says, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her." This story teaches us that in the busyness of life, the most important thing is our relationship with God. In those moments of solitude, God offers us the peace and direction we need to move forward. As we reflect on the journey through isolation, we can hold on to God's promises, knowing that this is not the end, but the beginning of something new. In Isaiah 43:19, God declares, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the desert and streams in the wasteland." These words remind us that the season of isolation is just the prelude to something greater. Through this time, God is preparing the ground for new opportunities, new growth, and blessings that we could never have imagined. Isolation is not merely a period of loneliness, but a divine and intentional process through which God shapes us, refines us, and ultimately transforms us into vessels of his strength and power. Though the desert may seem barren and desolate, it is within these quiet, solitary spaces that God molds our hearts in ways we cannot fully comprehend at the time. As we traverse these challenging moments, we begin to understand that our experiences of isolation are not just for our healing, but also for the greater good of those around us. God, in his infinite wisdom, uses our pain and solitude to equip us to comfort others in their darkest hours. This truth is beautifully expressed in Corinthians 1:034, where the Apostle Paul writes, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we have received from God." This verse serves as a powerful reminder that our struggles are not in vain. They are meant to be a living testimony of God's boundless grace and mercy. When we emerge from these periods of suffering and isolation, we can look back with profound gratitude, recognizing how each painful step has led us to a deeper faith, a stronger trust, and a clearer purpose. As the psalmist says in Psalm 41:3, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him." This is the transformative power of isolation, a divine process that, though difficult and often painful, leads us into a place where our lives can testify to the greatness of God. Isolation, however, is not just about internal growth. It is also a protective measure, a divine safeguard against forces that might lead us astray. There are times when God, in His infinite care, separates us from people, situations, and paths that could derail us from His intended purpose. It can be hard to see at the moment, especially when the isolation feels like a punishment or a detour from what we had planned. But God, in His wisdom, sees far beyond our understanding, and His hand of protection is at work even when we cannot perceive it. Proverbs 3:5-6 exhorts us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. This verse calls us to trust even when we feel lost, and to rely on God's vision when our own is clouded by confusion. A profound example of this divine protection can be seen in the story of Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. When King Herod sought to kill Jesus, God intervened through a dream, directing Joseph to flee with his family to Egypt. In Matthew 2:13 we read, "Get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." This moment of isolation, though unexpected, was not a punishment, but an act of divine protection. It was through this separation that God's plan was safeguarded and His purpose remained intact. Likewise, God often removes us from situations or people that at the time we may not fully understand, but over time His hand of protection becomes clear, guiding us back to His intended path. Isolation also teaches us invaluable lessons about what truly matters in life. When the noise of the world is silenced, and we are left alone with God, we begin to realign our priorities. The distractions that once seemed so pressing fade away, and we are left with the simple yet profound realization that the most important thing in life is our relationship with Him. Consider the story of Martha and Mary in Luke 10. Martha, overwhelmed by the demands of preparing a meal, found herself distracted by all the things that needed to be done. Meanwhile, her sister Mary chose to sit at Jesus' feet, listening to Him. Jesus, with gentle but firm love, told Martha, "Few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken away from her." Luke 10:42. In moments of isolation, God calls us to choose the better part, to prioritize what is eternal over what is temporary. This shift in perspective does not only benefit us spiritually, but it also equips us with the wisdom to handle the blessings that God will eventually place in our hand. In Deuteronomy 8:03, God speaks to His people as they journey through the desert, saying, "He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." In the desert, God taught His people that true nourishment comes not from physical sustenance, but from His Word, a lesson that resonates deeply in times of isolation. Through this experience of dependence, God prepared them to enter the promised land with hearts that were humble and full of gratitude. In our lives, moments of isolation often feel like they are meaningless pauses in the action, but in reality, they are invaluable opportunities to learn, grow, and prepare for the future. David, long before he became king, spent years alone in the fields caring for sheep. It seemed like a forgotten, insignificant part of his life. Yet it was in that solitude that David learned the lessons that would later equip him to lead a nation. He wrote many of the Psalms that continue to inspire us today, such as Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." In the quiet of the fields, David not only communed with God, but also developed the skills of leadership that would guide him in the years to come. God used that period of isolation to mold him into the man He had called him to be, just as He uses our moments of solitude to shape us for the purposes He has in store for us. Consider also the story of Paul and Silas, who, despite being wrongfully imprisoned, did not allow their isolation to diminish their connection with God. In Acts 16:25-26, we read that at midnight they were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, an earthquake shook the foundations of the prison. This miraculous event demonstrated God's power, but it also showed how faith, even in the most difficult circumstances, can transform a place of isolation into a platform for freedom and testimony. The isolation that they faced was not a dead end. It became the catalyst for a powerful display of God's glory. As we look at these stories, it becomes clear that isolation is not merely a trial to endure, but a divine invitation to be shaped and used by God in ways we never imagined. Our stories of isolation and transformation can be the very testimonies that inspire others to trust in God's faithfulness. Take the story of Esther, for example. As Queen of Persia, Esther faced profound internal isolation as she kept her identity as a Jew hidden. Yet when the time came for her to act, God used her position to save an entire nation. In Esther 4:14, Mordecai says to her, "Who knows if you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther's period of isolation prepared her to be the instrument of God's redemptive plan for her people. Similarly, our times of solitude can position us to fulfill a purpose far greater than we ever imagined. In the desert, God plants seeds of hope and purpose that in due time will bear abundant fruit. Galatians 6:9 reminds us, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Even when the journey is long and the road is tough, God promises that faithfulness will yield a harvest, and the fruit of our labor will be worth every moment of isolation. Ultimately, isolation helps us tune our hearts to hear God's voice more clearly. In 1 Kings 19:11 and 12, when Elijah sought God amid his despair, God did not speak through the mighty wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, he spoke in a gentle whisper. This teaches us that sometimes it is in the quiet, secluded moments of our lives that we can hear God's voice with clarity. These moments of solitude are not punishments, but invitations to draw nearer to God, to listen to his voice, and to discern his will. In the end, the isolation God allows in our lives is not a punishment, but a profound opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become the people he has created us to be. Through this process, we are not only transformed, but we also become a living testament to God's love, faithfulness, and divine purpose. As we continue our journey through life, it's crucial to remember that God wastes nothing. Every moment spent in isolation, every tear that falls, and every prayer whispered in the stillness carries with it an eternal purpose. When we find ourselves in places of solitude and suffering, it's easy to feel as though we are lost, waiting for something to change. But God sees these moments through a different lens. He uses them as a vital part of his plan, working in us in ways we may never fully understand until we look back. Psalm 126, 5 and 6 beautifully captures this promise. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. This verse offers hope in the darkest moments, reminding us that our sorrow is not in vain. Like seeds planted in the soil, our pain and longing, though they may feel like a burden, will eventually bear fruit. Fruit that will glorify God and bless others in ways we can't yet imagine. As we endure hardship and wait in silence, we are preparing to receive a harvest of joy, peace, and restoration. When we finally emerge from seasons of isolation, we are no longer the same. God uses these times to shape us, to refine our character, and to renew our spirit. We come out of them stronger, more resilient, and more aligned with the purpose he has for us. Isaiah 61:3 reminds us that he will give us a crown of beauty instead of ashes. the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. This promise of transformation is one of the most powerful aspects of God's work in our lives. What seems like a period of destruction, where our dreams and hopes may feel shattered, is the beginning of something beautiful. God is in the business of turning our ashes into beauty, our mourning into joy, and our despair into praise. It's a process that often feels slow and painful, but when we look back, we see that it was all part of God's plan to prepare us for something greater. The divine purpose behind isolation is always for our good, to prepare us for the blessings God has reserved for us. But these seasons are not merely about receiving gifts from God. They are invitations to know Him more deeply. They invite us to find in His presence an inexhaustible source of strength and direction. We may feel as though we are being delayed, left in a holding pattern, but in truth, what seems like a delay is often an act of mercy. God knows that there are times when we need to pause, to wait, to allow our hearts to be shaped and our understanding to deepen. He is protecting us from rushing too quickly into something we are not yet ready to handle. In Isaiah 55, 9 through 9, God reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This is a powerful reminder that God sees the bigger picture. He understands the timeline, the journey, and the lessons we need to learn along the way. When we find ourselves in seasons of waiting or isolation, we can trust that His plan is always better than our own, even when we cannot see the road ahead. One of the clearest examples of God using isolation for His divine purposes can be seen in the life of Moses. After fleeing Egypt, Moses spent 40 long years in the desert, separated from the life he had once known as a prince. Those years in isolation seemed like a waste, years spent tending sheep in a foreign land, but God was using them to prepare Moses for the monumental task ahead. During this time, Moses learned humility, patience, and most importantly, a deep dependence on God. He was no longer the impulsive man who had acted out in anger, but a man shaped by solitude, ready to listen and obey the call of God when God called him from the burning bush in Exodus 3:10, saying, "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses responded with obedience, not out of strength, but from a place of humility that had been forged in the desert. The Moses who returned to Egypt was no longer the same man who had fled. His time of isolation had transformed him into a servant of God, ready to fulfill His divine calling. This is how God works in our lives as well. Through seasons of solitude, He refines our hearts and reshapes our priorities, preparing us for the tasks and blessings He has ahead for us. The Apostle Paul, too, shares how his time of isolation taught him invaluable lessons in Philippians 4:11 through 13. "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or want. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength." These words were not written from a place of comfort or abundance, but from the depths of hardship. Paul learned to find contentment not because of external circumstances, but because of the inner strength he drew from Christ. In times of isolation, when everything else seems stripped away, we are left with nothing but our faith in God. And it is in those moments that we learn the true strength that only comes from Him. The story of Esther is another powerful example of how God uses moments of apparent silence and isolation to position us for His purposes. As Queen of Persia, Esther kept her Jewish identity hidden, facing the isolation of being in a position of power, but unable to reveal her true self. Yet when the time was right, God used her quiet years in the palace to prepare her for the bold, life-altering decision she would soon fade. In Esther 4:16, she declares, I will go to the king even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. This was a moment of profound courage, but it came from a heart that had been prepared in isolation. Esther's time of concealment was not a place of abandonment. It was a carefully orchestrated period of preparation for a greater purpose. Her story teaches us that even in our quietest moments, God is working behind the scenes, positioning us for His divine plan at the perfect time. As we walk through our times of isolation, we must remember that what we sow in those seasons, our tears, our prayers, our faith, will eventually bear fruit. Galatians 6:9 encourages us, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Though the road may be long and filled with moments of heartache, we are assured that in God's perfect timing, we will reap the harvest of joy and peace that comes from our faithfulness. These seasons are not just about enduring, they are about growing. They are about learning to trust in God's provision and timing, about coming to know Him more deeply, and about being shaped into the person He has always intended for us to be. In the quiet of our isolation, God is speaking, and it is in those silent moments that we often hear Him most clearly. Just as Elijah found God in the still small voice in 1 Kings 19:11-12, we too can find God's direction in the whispers of our hearts. These moments are not a punishment. They are an invitation to draw closer, to listen more intently, and to trust that God is guiding us every step of the way. Here are some valuable lessons. Isolation is preparation. Just as Jesus, Moses, David, and others experienced moments of isolation before their divine missions, we can understand that these periods are not punishments, but opportunities for transformation, growth, and spiritual strength. Faith in God's timing. Through stories like Joseph's and Hannah's, we learn that even when it seems like everything is at a standstill, God is working behind the scenes. Trusting His timing is crucial as He prepares us for greater purposes. God uses our weaknesses. In isolation, we often face our weaknesses, fears, and insecurities. These moments are not for us to despair, but to allow God to work through them, refining us and making us stronger in faith. Dependence on God. Just as the Israelites learned to rely on God for provision in the desert, we too are reminded that in times of solitude, we can only depend on God's strength, wisdom, and timing. Redemptive purpose. Isolation may seem like a setback, but it is often a divine setup. Through solitude, we can encounter God's presence in ways that transform us and prepare us for the blessings ahead. The power of stillness, as Psalm 46:10 invites us to be still and know that I am God. Isolation is an opportunity to experience God's presence more deeply, away from distractions and noise. Trust in God's plan. Even when we face moments of confusion or pain, trusting that God's plan is greater than what we can see helps us endure these periods with faith and hope. Question to the audience: what have you learned from this video so far? Please comment below with one key lesson you've gained and how you plan to practice it in your life. Call to action. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.